Thank you, Chair. Uh, like some of you in this audience, or if not most of you, I am also a recent convert to this discipline of cyber security, thanks to the initiative by Dr. Cherian Samuel and Dr. Lele. So I will be, by and large, giving a strategic analysis perspective of how this domain is evolving. I'll start with an anecdote of how we at IDSA had our first kind of assignation with cyber problems. This was sometime in 2008 when many of us started getting a lot of spurious emails and lot of fake email IDs were created in our name in different accounts, and infected attachments were sent across to the strategic community. And this increased over a period of time, like the various spurious mails I am listing out there, mostly from which our colleagues got here, and we used to repeatedly send out security warnings. But we didn't find anything unusual about it initially. And we thought, why should someone target us? So it was seen as a normal hacker activity until this report came in 2010 from a Canadian institute, which talked about this. They were investigating various incidents of large-scale hacking and intrusion across institutions around the world, and this was based on one of their earlier studies called Tracking GhostNet. And the highlight of their second report was these references about India. And they talked about how hackers with sources traced to China were attacking Indian defense institutions, including NSCS. And the particular reference to IDSA is listed out there. I hope you can read it clearly, and how IDSA was one of those institutions which were specifically targeted. Now, the point is, this was between 2008 to 10, and this was also the period, like you know, how Baltic republics like Estonia were attacked with sources blamed to Russia. And now, if you look at the scenario then and how things have changed right now, one would see not much change happening in terms of one. There was a problem of situational awareness or technical wherewithal then. It were limited then for decision makers to understand and recognize the threat. Though states are more alert to this threat right now, but still the kind of knowledge deficit kind of haunts policymakers quite a lot, especially the way the threat matrix is evolving. And attribution and retaliation were a problem then as it is now. And despite the many kind of news we see about how countries blame each other, there is a general kind of reluctance, fearing diplomatic embarrassment, and of course the question of plausible deniability has always been evoked strongly on this. So this is the way the system is evolving here, and transnational cyber attacks are increasing. And so what we have to see now is how, even if we assume this is a warfare of some kind, how this domain is kind of evolving, and how central is the vulnerability of CNI, that's critical national infrastructure, in this. What actions could trigger more hostilities in this domain, and what are the red lines states are going to draw. Basically, when you look at CNI or generally the domain of cyberspace and conflict in this zone, you can classify most of the threats in these two segments called CNE and CNA, the exploitation and the attacks. Exploitation is one which is happening quite regularly, the espionage, data theft and all, which is seen as a more innocuous kind of activity in comparison to attacks, which include all kind of subversive actions, disruption, destruction, all these elements which the intended outcome would be destruction, if not mass, but certainly destruction. So there are some attributes the way the cyber domain, even if for conflict or warfare, whichever way you see it. I don't want to go into details of each attributes which I am listing here, but just to run through it, like one, it's a porous domain where low levels of entry, a seamless kind of spectrum, and in Joseph Nye's word, this is where power diffusion of power is happening quite strongly. Even the best of military powers are finding their vulnerability strong and their military strength not really adding up to it. and the asymmetry which was discussed quite strongly yesterday here. But I see when you take it from the Clausewitzian sense, they say war is continuation of policy by other means. But in cyber, it might be war by other means, undertaking war by other means. Some of the features I have described there. Then the way it is evolving as a proxy battle zone. Of course, yesterday Arun was trying to differentiate between state actors, non-state actors as agency, and the difference between a proxy actor and all. But I think the political objective of each attack and the nature of actors involved would differentiate the kind of the purpose for which each attack is initiated, and by that standards, this cyber spectrum and the way conflict is being happening, certainly it is evolving as a proxy element, of course with the possible deniability, like the ghost protocol of IMF being invoked regularly, like we see in our South Asian case when it comes to terrorism. Another aspect is about the metaphor I would like to use about this segment, which I'd say terror of the code, because a whole new generation with a immaculate grip over the programming code is getting unprecedented power, and their knowledge, know-how is being exploited by states, and of course, needless to say, the way non-state groups have optimally exploited this spectrum has been discussed earlier in this spectrum, in this sessions here. So when you talk about norms as another issue, I think the way the spectrum has evolved, the subversion has become the norm. Rather than countries trying to talk about norms to bring order in the system, people talk about order, stability, national cyber laws, but the way countries prefer to operate in this domain is about subversion as the operational norm. And finally, about strategic balancing, of course, that's a word carried away from strategic analysis, but it's a heavy word for cyberspace. But the way countries are building up their military cyber capabilities, techno-military commands, and integrating these capabilities into their regular military and strategic doctrines itself kind of shows how the rebalancing is happening in this technological frontier. So I'm just running through some of these headlines, one of which will in fact answer Colonel Gautam's question about who is behind Stuxnet, and some of these cartoons just to break the monotony, which shows how the world is looking at the evolution of this segment. And finally, this message is quite strong about being who is behind this. So coming to the main issue about CNI, why is CNI so important? It has already been explained by one of our panelists here about how it can bring a nation to standstill. But different nations have different varying kind of dependence on CNI systems, on, so certainly the kind of results of a major attack on CNI would be varying. But you could look at this particular reference of US Congressional Commission on what they say. If there is a major and prolonged blackout happening in US, 90% would be affected, and certainly so all these doomsday theories like cyber, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, all these things are being discussed. The US Department of Homeland Security identifies 16 critical CNI sectors, and covering most of those areas which the society considers as vital, though energy is seen to be the most vulnerable. And I talk about some surveys which show about how the energy sector is being seen as vulnerable by most people. Even in India, we had this power grid blackout in 2012, which affected the half of this country, nearly more than 300 million people. So one issue when we talk about CNI is people have this paranoia about nuclear sector being coming up with a kind of a holistic dimension. If people talk about how what happens if an operational nuclear plant is hit by cyber attacks, and what is a kind of destruction that is going to happen. Caroline already talked about the study Chatham House did on this, so I'm not going to discuss about SCADA or air gap systems and all. But what I feel is, despite all the kind of high secure systems which are being talked about, Caroline talked about how vulnerabilities still persist. But I think, I don't think nuclear facilities are more vulnerable than any other CNI systems, or less vulnerable. So it's like a physical assault on any major CNI facility, a terrorist attack, or even a poisoning of a mass water body. all these, so when we are talking about a highly secure facility, a nuclear facility, threats are as good or potent as other CNA factors. So how still the risk matters is that how we are going to address is that there might be a need to progress towards a culture or ecosystem of high securitization where none is trusted, complacency is penalized, and every scenarios of vulnerability are reimagined. And this applies for the whole CNI sector, not just nuclear. So is such a perpetual state of alert possible? People might doubt that. That's where deterrence might come in. And a lot of studies on deterrence in cyber domain have taken lessons from the nuclear spectrum. And three aspects, some of which I have already highlighted, I've listed here why deterrence and cyber power, the correlation is quite strong. But most importantly, it's about the multiple manifestations of the technology that has increased its strategic utility, where CNI is now seen as counter force and counter value assets as seen in the nuclear spectrum. I'll just run through it. So would nuclear lessons apply in cyber domain? For deterrence to work, the conventional model says, one, the cost of the attacking a state should be seen as outweighing the adversary's perceived gain. Second, the state should convey the capability and intention to retaliate massively or assure destruction or unacceptable damage. And third, this threat should be conveyed credibly. And fourth, the adversary should be a rational actor who takes this threat seriously. Now look at the cyber domain, where it's completely about asymmetry, proxy warfare, non-state actors, plausible deniability. Are these factors of nuclear deterrence going to work? That's what I have listed there. The fundamental point is there is a target vacuum, there is problem of false flags, you are unable to identify to whom you will give the threat of massive retaliation, and whether the question of costs and gains are taken up when states itself think you can attack your adversary using the cyberspace with minimal political cost. Where is this whole consideration of costs and gains weighing up? So the way we look at deterrence in the fundamental spectrum may have difficulties in the way cyber deterrence is evolving. Now let's look at the US cyber defense strategy. They brought out this strategy in 2015. They talk about three pillars: response, that is through to deter, defend, to deny, and resilience to withstand any attack. Now many countries are questioning one special aspect about this US strategy is, despite all these contentions about retaliation and targeting the countries, like some people said, the territory from which it is originating should be held responsible. That state should be held responsible. And then another segment said you should go beyond nuclear cyber responses into kinetic response, and maybe people are building escalation models all the way up to the nuclear level. So the US DoD strategy at least is not hyper on this front. They are talking about military and non-military, but largely you will have to stick to non-military measures like political and economic sanctions, which they applied on North Korea, which was the first such case of us office formally retaliating to a state. Then there is this question about, if this territorial, you trace a source to a particular territory, if he is a friend or ally of yours, are you going to bomb them? Are you going to use kinetic sources? Are you even going to have a cyber retaliation against them? So these complexities of geopolitics will certainly come into play here. So the way the deterrence is evolving in the cyberspace is about two pillars: denial, deterrence, and retaliation. Though retaliation, like I said, has its inherent limitations. So denial through strong defenses is the trend which states are increasingly building up. Of course, when retaliation has to come up, states have to have a very clear declaratory policy on how they are going to respond through asymmetric responses, or even at their own terms. So finally, about the normative conundrum. Norms have been discussed in detail yesterday here. But what the fundamental point I would argue is, despite states' clamor for norms, no one is really very enthusiastic about bringing about an international convention or treaties, for the fact that, like I said earlier, subversion has become an operational kind of preference for states. So why should you bring in norms to kind of limit the advantage you have in this technological spectrum? So when people talk about taking nuclear lessons, they talk about how NPT has come in. So why don't you have a similar thing in the cyber spectrum. NPT came up in 1968 because of the connivance of two superpowers who thought new nuclear weapon states should not emerge in the horizon. If you look at the way norm and entrepreneurship is happening in the cyber domain right now, geopolitics is strongly out there. Whatever US proposals are put up, China and Russia oppose. Whatever Russia talks about, US has brought out saying it's propaganda, all those things. So this is the way the whole idea, the process of normative construction in this domain is happening right now. Maybe things are likely to change, but there are a lot of incompatibilities. Like I said, one I would like to highlight is the oxymoronic entities like ethical hacker. It's like good Taliban and bad Taliban. So within this larger spectrum, are norms going to work out? I end by asking this question: is cyber emerging as the new strategy? Thank you, sir.